"This house is perfect for a young couple," Marjorie Hale said, as she slowly turned in her chair, looking around the room as though she were inspecting a property she intended to buy. She didn't lower her voice, soften her tone, or ask the question as a favor. I calmly set my fork beside my plate before looking directly at her. "Then why aren't they moving into yours?" I asked. Before we continue, welcome back to the Quiet Revenge Stories channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's get back to what happened next. The silence that followed settled over the dining room immediately. Callum lowered his eyes to his plate without saying a word. Bryn drew in a quiet breath, and Marjorie's expression tightened just enough to acknowledge that she hadn't expected resistance. Even so, she didn't retreat. "Oh, Leora," she replied lightly as she folded her hands together on the table. "My townhouse is small. You've been there before. It only has 2 bedrooms, there's no real yard, and the traffic from Henderson Road never lets up. This place is different. It's peaceful, it's spacious, and you're not even using all of it." There it was. Not a request, an evaluation. I let my eyes drift around the dining room that had been my home for so many years. Family photographs lined the walls. The old oak sideboard stood exactly where my husband and I had placed it decades earlier, and the windows looked out toward the Blue Ridge foothills. I had prepared the entire dinner myself, arranged the table myself, and even remembered that Bryn preferred sparkling water instead of still. Yet somewhere between the first course and dessert, my home had quietly transformed into an asset they believed should be reassigned. Callum cleared his throat but offered nothing more. He didn't deny what had been said. He didn't defend me, and he certainly didn't challenge the conversation. His silence spoke almost as loudly as Marjorie's words. "Young couples deserve a head start," Marjorie continued, speaking as though she were explaining something perfectly reasonable. "It would take so much pressure off their shoulders." At that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't an idea that had appeared during dinner. It had been discussed beforehand, polished carefully, and rehearsed until every sentence sounded natural. They hadn't come hoping I might agree. They had arrived expecting that I would. "This home didn't simply appear one day," I replied evenly. "My husband and I spent years building toward it." Marjorie tilted her head ever so slightly. "And now you're comfortable," she said. "You can afford to be generous." "I can absolutely help you create a plan," I answered. "What I won't do is hand you the finish line." Bryn shifted in her chair, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor, while Callum's shoulders seemed to sink lower with every passing second. Nobody raised a voice because they didn't need to. The real point had already been made. A few minutes later, I carried the empty plates into the kitchen while listening to the quiet conversation drifting in from the porch. Standing at the sink, I realized something with remarkable clarity. They hadn't invited themselves to dinner simply to spend time together. They had come to measure what they believed they were entitled to take. When they returned inside, everyone behaved as though nothing important had happened, but the atmosphere had changed completely. I didn't sit back down. Instead, I remained standing beside the kitchen counter with my hands resting against the cool stone surface, allowing the silence to stretch until someone finally decided to break it. "You make it sound like we're asking for something outrageous," Bryn said carefully. I looked first at her, then at Callum. "You're asking me to move backward through my own life." Marjorie let out a quiet breath, her patience already beginning to wear thin. "No one is trying to erase everything you've worked for Leora. That's exactly what you're asking me to do." My voice remained calm because I didn't need a long speech to explain what should have been obvious. The truth was simple enough. "Your father and I began in a tiny one-bedroom rental," I said. "The cabinets were peeling and the windows rattled every time a truck drove past. We saved until we could afford a modest condominium. It wasn't impressive, but it was ours. After that, we bought an older house that needed constant repairs, and we renovated it one room at a time, while paying off debt before spending money on anything unnecessary. 24 years later, we finally moved into this home. Not because someone gave it to us, but because we earned every single step along the way. I met my son's eyes. You and Bryn are standing exactly where your father and I once stood. The difference is that we never expected to begin where we finished. Callum rubbed his hands together nervously before speaking. Mom, it would only be temporary. I held his gaze for a moment before answering. Temporary is one of those words that sounds comforting because nobody ever defines it. Temporary until the next raise. Temporary until another refinance. Temporary until your spending habits somehow fix themselves. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when nobody is willing to set an ending. Marjorie's posture stiffened. You're turning this into a matter of principle. Because it is a matter of principle. Callum leaned forward slightly. You always told me you'd help if I needed it. I will always help you build, I answered quietly. What I won't do is finance irresponsibility. The words settled over the room with far more weight than I intended. Bryn's expression immediately hardened. Marjorie's lips pressed into a thin line, and Callum fell silent once again. No one argued after that. They collected their coats. Marjorie offered a polite farewell that never reached her eyes. Bryn avoided looking at me altogether, and Callum hesitated briefly at the front door, as though he wanted to say something different before following the others outside. After their car disappeared down the street, I remained standing in the hallway, listening to the familiar silence return to my home. One thought lingered in my mind long after the taillights had vanished. If all they wanted was a place to stay, why did it already feel as though they had measured where every piece of my furniture would go? 3 weeks passed without anyone mentioning my house again. Callum's phone calls became noticeably shorter, and before long they were replaced almost entirely by brief text messages. Whenever I asked how work was going, he answered with vague reassurances that everything was fine. If I asked about the townhouse he and Bryn had purchased 2 years earlier, his response never changed. It's fine. Every answer sounded practiced, as though he had already decided exactly how much he was willing to reveal. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, an envelope arrived, tucked between my utility bills and a gardening catalog. It was addressed to Callum Vance, but underneath his name appeared my address listed as a secondary contact. For a moment I frowned, unable to understand why any of his financial correspondence would still be connected to me. Then I remembered. Years earlier, when Callum was 23 and eager to establish good credit, I had co-signed a modest car loan for him. He refinanced it later, and I'd assumed my information had been removed from every related account. Apparently, that assumption had been wrong. I opened the envelope carefully. The first page was a delinquency notice. The second showed a mortgage that was already past due. The third detailed a second line of credit that had reached its borrowing limit. The language throughout the documents was dry and professional, but the numbers painted a far more alarming picture. I read every page twice before quietly setting them on the dining table and reaching for my phone. Callum answered on the 4th ring. Mom, I received a letter today. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke until I finally heard him let out a slow breath. I was going to tell you. Tell me what... It's not as bad as it looks. I waited. The mortgage rate adjusted, he explained. It went up a lot more than we expected, and we've been trying to juggle everything. What exactly are you juggling? He hesitated just long enough to answer my question without speaking. Credit cards, he admitted at last. Some furniture purchases. We wanted the house to feel right. And the SUV lease Bryn insisted on, I asked, and he let out a quiet sigh before admitting that it was part of the problem as well. He quickly added that everything was only temporary, a word I had already heard too many times, and I pressed further by asking how many mortgage payments were overdue. When he answered that there were 2, I followed by asking about the credit line, and he admitted it was already maxed out. I lowered my gaze to the paperwork spread across the table before asking if his solution had been to move into my house, and he responded almost immediately that it would give them some breathing room just until they could stabilize. I studied the figures again, but nothing about them suggested any real stability. This wasn't the story of a young couple struggling through an unexpected hardship. It was the story of two adults who had deliberately built a lifestyle beyond their income and expected someone else to absorb the consequences once the numbers stopped working. "You're not trying to get started, Callum," I said quietly. "You're trying to maintain a life you can't actually afford. That's not fair." "It's accurate." Silence settled over the call once again. I folded the papers neatly and slipped them back into the envelope while replaying our dinner conversation from 3 weeks earlier. Suddenly, every piece fell into place. Marjorie's confidence, Bryn's carefully chosen words, and Callum's repeated insistence that everything would only be temporary all carried an entirely different meaning now. They hadn't been asking for an opportunity. They'd been asking for an escape. "I think we need to talk in person," I said finally. For the first time in weeks, Callum didn't argue. When I ended the call, I remained seated at the table for several minutes. The house itself hadn't changed. The same afternoon light still streamed through the windows, the same grandfather clock ticked quietly in the hallway, and everything looked exactly as it had before I opened that envelope. Yet something inside me had settled into absolute clarity. This was no longer about my house. It was about accountability. The following Sunday, I invited all 3 of them back. I didn't prepare an elaborate dinner this time. There were no candles, no carefully arranged place settings, and no homemade desserts waiting on the counter. I simply brewed fresh coffee and placed the envelope neatly in front of my chair before they arrived. Callum came first with Bryn beside him. Marjorie arrived 10 minutes later, wearing the same composed expression she'd worn the night she quietly evaluated my living room. Once everyone was seated, I slid the paperwork across the table toward Callum. "I received these." He didn't reach for them. He didn't need to. Bryn picked up the stack instead, quickly scanned the numbers, and almost immediately pushed the papers away as though touching them made the situation more real. "Everyone our age lives like this," she said. "Mortgage rates change, credit goes up and down. It's completely normal. Being 2 months behind on your mortgage isn't normal," I replied calmly. Marjorie leaned forward. "They simply need some stability. That's all we've been trying to explain. If they weren't drowning in payments, they'd finally have a chance to reset." I looked directly at her. Stability doesn't come from someone else's deed. No one spoke for several seconds. Callum rubbed both hands across his face before finally looking up. "Mom, we're not asking you to give the house away forever." "No," I answered. "You're asking me to absorb the consequences of your decisions." Bryn's voice immediately sharpened. "We're asking for support." I turned toward Marjorie. "If you believe in this plan so strongly, why don't you transfer your townhouse to them?" The room became completely silent. This time even Marjorie's composure slipped. "That's different." "No," I replied evenly. "It isn't." Her jaw tightened. "My townhouse is my retirement security." "And this house is mine," I answered. "It represents decades of work, discipline, sacrifice, and careful planning. I won't apologize for protecting it." Callum pushed his chair back slightly. "You're making this into something much bigger than it needs to be." "I'm simply calling it exactly what it is." He looked from me to Marjorie and back again, frustration becoming impossible to hide. "So there's no way you'll help us?" "I will absolutely help you rebuild," I said. "What I won't do is help you avoid the consequences that rebuilding requires." No one shouted. No one stormed out. Yet something permanent shifted around that table. They had arrived expecting negotiation. Instead, they found a boundary that wasn't moving. After they left that afternoon, I stood at the front window and watched the 3 of them gather beside their car. They spoke quietly among themselves, their expressions serious, their movements restrained. And although I couldn't hear a single word, I recognized exactly what I was seeing. They weren't discussing whether I was right or wrong anymore. They were recalculating. The conversation had shifted from persuasion to damage control, because for the first time they understood my answer wasn't going to change. Nearly 2 months passed before I heard anything significant again. One afternoon, while reviewing local real estate listings online, a familiar photograph caught my attention. It was Callum and Bryn's townhouse. The listing had been professionally staged, with neutral furniture, spotless rooms, and carefully edited photographs designed to make everything appear effortless. Yet one detail stood out more than anything else: reduced price, motivated sellers. The wording was polished, but the numbers told the real story. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Callum. "We're downsizing." I read the message several times before setting the phone aside. Downsizing suggested a thoughtful decision, the kind people make after weighing different options. What I was looking at wasn't a choice, it was arithmetic. Within 3 weeks, the public records confirmed the sale had closed below what they still owed on the property. Between the reduced selling price and closing costs, almost every dollar of equity they had built over 2 years disappeared with a single signature. Then came the next development. They moved into Marjorie's townhouse. She announced it herself with a cheerful photograph on social media. Bryn smiled beside her mother, while Callum carried another box through the front door, and beneath the picture she added a simple caption: "Family comes first." I didn't respond. I didn't leave a comment. I simply kept scrolling. At first, everything looked exactly the way Marjorie had imagined. The townhouse was tidy, organized, and efficient despite its limited space. It had 2 bedrooms, a small office, very little storage, and only enough parking for 2 vehicles. For the first couple of weeks, the arrangement appeared manageable. Gradually, however, the small signs of strain began appearing. Callum's SUV occupied most of the driveway, forcing Marjorie to leave her own car on the street. Bryn started rearranging furniture to make room for additional belongings. Unopened boxes remained stacked along the hallway walls, and eventually a second desk appeared where the dining area used to be. Before long, neighbors were posting online about overnight parking violations, and through a mutual acquaintance I heard that raised voices had become a regular occurrence inside the townhouse. Doors were closing harder than necessary, utility bills had increased sharply, and even Marjorie began making lighthearted comments online about adjusting to a busier household. The humor didn't last. Bryn still hadn't found steady work. Callum was between contracts again. No rent was changing hands. Only promises. Watching everything unfold, I couldn't help recognizing the pattern because I'd seen it forming months earlier around my own dining table. Marjorie believed she was offering temporary shelter, a brief opportunity for them to regain their footing before moving forward again. What she failed to realize was that temporary arrangements rarely stay temporary when nothing forces them to end. Space grows tighter, patience grows thinner, and resentment quietly settles into every corner long before anyone admits it's there. 3 months after they moved into her townhouse, my phone rang on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I glanced at the screen before answering and immediately knew the conversation wouldn't sound anything like the confident proposal Marjorie had delivered in my dining room. Her voice had changed. It no longer carried its usual confidence or careful composure. "Leora," she said, softly skipping every polite introduction. "They won't leave." I let the silence sit between us for a moment before asking a simple question. "What changed?" She sighed heavily. "Nothing," she answered at first, then corrected herself almost immediately. "That's exactly the problem." She explained that Bryn had rejected every smaller apartment they looked at because none of them met the standard she wanted. One neighborhood was too crowded, another was too far from work, and another simply wasn't nice enough. Meanwhile, Callum's contract work remained inconsistent, applications were left unfinished, and the remaining debt from the townhouse sale continued following them despite the move. "The creditors are still calling," Marjorie admitted quietly. "I honestly didn't realize those balances would keep chasing them." "They don't disappear when people change addresses," I replied. "Debt simply follows them." After another long pause, she spoke again. "I met with an attorney. I already knew what was coming. About eviction." The word lingered between us. I never imagined I'd have to think about evicting my own daughter. I folded my hands together on the table before asking, "What did the attorney tell you?" "He said that because there's no written lease and they aren't paying rent, I can serve notice. But he also warned me it would become very unpleasant." For a moment, I thought back to the photograph she'd proudly posted only a few months earlier. Family comes first. I honestly believed they just needed time, she admitted. A fresh start. A little stability. I answered as gently as I could. Time doesn't change habits, Marjorie. It only reveals them. The silence that followed felt completely different from every conversation we'd had before. It wasn't defensive anymore. It sounded thoughtful. Finally, she let out a slow breath. I should have listened to you. There was no satisfaction in hearing those words, only recognition. I'm glad you understand it now, I said quietly. She explained that they had largely stopped looking for another place because they assumed she would never force the issue. I asked one final question. And will you? There was another pause, but this one carried certainty instead of hesitation. Yes. After we ended the call, I remained seated for several minutes, thinking about how easily generosity can become obligation when boundaries are never clearly defined. Marjorie believed she had offered temporary refuge, but without realizing it, she had created permanence. That was exactly the future she had once expected me to accept, and now she was living through the very lesson she had tried so hard to convince me to ignore. A week after my conversation with Marjorie Callum came to see me. He didn't send a text beforehand or call to ask whether I was home. I happened to notice his car pulling into the driveway, and instead of getting out immediately, he remained behind the steering wheel for nearly a full minute. When he finally stepped onto the porch and I opened the front door, I was struck by how different he looked. He wasn't angry, defensive, or impatient. He simply looked exhausted, as though months of carrying problems he could no longer ignore had finally caught up with him. Hi, Mom, he said quietly. I stepped aside and invited him in. We settled at the kitchen table with nothing between us except 2 cups of coffee. There were no financial statements, no envelopes, and no carefully prepared arguments this time. For several moments, neither of us spoke until he finally broke the silence. I heard you talk to Marjorie. I did. He nodded slowly before lowering his eyes to the table. She's serious about asking us to leave. Yes. He rubbed his palms together, searching for words that seemed much harder to find than they once had. I honestly thought it would make everything easier. Easier for who, I asked? He started to answer automatically. For everyone. Then he stopped, shook his head, and corrected himself. No, easier for me. Easier for Bryn. I didn't interrupt. He continued, speaking more honestly than he had in months. We thought if we could just lower the pressure for a while, everything would eventually balance itself out. By transferring that pressure to someone else, I replied. He didn't argue. Instead, he stared quietly into his coffee before speaking again. It felt like everyone around us was moving ahead. Friends were buying larger homes, replacing their cars every few years, posting vacations and promotions online. I kept feeling like we were falling behind, and after a while it seemed like we had to keep up. At what cost? The question lingered between us. Finally, he admitted what I had suspected all along. I guess I always believed that if something went wrong, you'd help. There was no accusation in his voice, no entitlement. Only an expectation that had quietly taken root over many years. I have always helped you, I said calmly. But helping someone build a life isn't the same thing as rescuing them every time their decisions catch up with them. He nodded. I know. I raised you to move forward one step at a time, Callum. I never raised you to skip the difficult parts by standing on someone else's shoulders. He closed his eyes briefly before letting out a slow breath. I know. No one forced you to sign those loans. No one forced you to furnish a house you couldn't afford. And no one forced you to remain silent while your future mother-in-law suggested that I should hand over my home. That last sentence seemed to land harder than anything else. For the first time since he arrived, he looked directly at me. I didn't want to make the situation worse. He never explained for whom. He didn't need to. After another long silence, he asked the question I had been expecting since he walked through the front door. Is there any way back? I studied him carefully before answering. There's always a way back, but it begins with responsibility, not rescue. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though it wasn't relief I saw. It was acceptance. "It won't be easy," I continued. "It won't happen quickly, and it won't involve this house." He nodded again. "I understand." When he left that afternoon, he didn't ask for money, propose another arrangement, or try to reopen the conversation about my home. He simply thanked me for the coffee, said he would call soon, and drove away. 3 days later, Marjorie served formal notice. This time Callum didn't fight her decision. The following week, I met with my attorney. Unlike previous meetings, I wasn't there because of family conflict or uncertainty. I arrived with organized notes, clear goals, and a list of decisions I wanted documented properly. Together, we reviewed my estate plan line by line until we reached the section concerning my home. "I'd like the house transferred into a trust," I said. My attorney nodded and began outlining the process while I explained exactly what I wanted. There would be no vague promises, no informal understandings, and no assumptions left for anyone to interpret later. If Callum eventually inherited the house one day, it would happen only after he had demonstrated long-term financial responsibility. We documented every condition carefully. He would need to complete certified financial counseling. He would need to demonstrate sustained financial stability. There could be no outstanding legal judgments. There could be no co-signed debts connected to my name. "I want everything written clearly," I said. "I don't want anyone guessing what I intended." My attorney smiled slightly. "Structure prevents misunderstanding." "Exactly." Before leaving the office, I removed my name from every remaining financial connection that still linked me to Callum. Old loan notifications, secondary contact permissions, and every lingering authorization disappeared one by one until our finances were completely separate. Several days later, Callum called again. This time his voice sounded steadier. "I enrolled in debt counseling." "I'm glad to hear it. We're meeting twice a week." He hesitated before continuing. "Bryn thinks it's unnecessary." I smiled quietly to myself. Reality usually lasts longer than pride. He gave a soft laugh. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand that." Meanwhile, Marjorie continued moving through the eviction process exactly as her attorney had advised. It wasn't pleasant. There were arguments, raised voices, uncomfortable conversations with neighbors, and several difficult weeks inside that little townhouse. I heard about most of it indirectly, never through gossip that I encouraged, but through the natural way news eventually travels between people who have known one another for years. I stayed out of it completely. Instead, I returned to the routines that had always brought me peace. My mornings began with coffee on the back porch. Afternoons were often spent tending the garden, and every Thursday I attended my book club at the local library. Little by little, my home stopped feeling like something I had to defend and simply became what it had always been, a place I had earned through decades of work, patience, and careful choices. One evening after signing the final trust documents, I stood quietly in the living room and looked around the house that had become the center of so much conflict. Everything was exactly where it belonged, yet I realized something inside me had changed. Forgiveness and protection were not the same thing. I could sincerely hope Callum rebuilt his life while still keeping firm boundaries around my own, and understanding that difference gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a very long time. 6 months passed, and the urgency that had once consumed everyone's lives slowly gave way to routine. Callum eventually rented a modest apartment on the other side of town. It had 2 bedrooms, neutral carpeting, functional appliances, and nothing about it that anyone would describe as luxurious. Almost every piece of furniture inside came from estate sales, second-hand shops, or online marketplace listings. None of it matched particularly well, but every chair, table, and bookshelf had one thing in common. They were fully paid for. The leased SUV was gone as well. In its place sat a small used sedan that belonged entirely to him. The first time Callum mentioned that every bill had been paid on time for 3 consecutive months, he didn't present it as an accomplishment deserving applause. He simply stated it as a fact while we shared coffee in my kitchen, sounding less like someone searching for approval and more like a man beginning to understand the value of stability. "I never realized how much money disappeared into minimum payments," he admitted. "It wasn't only the money," I replied. "It was the pressure that came with it." He nodded. "I know that now." Bryn had also found part-time work. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the lifestyle she once imagined for herself, but it provided consistent income. According to Callum, they argued less than they used to, not because every problem had disappeared, but because there were fewer illusions left to defend. Once they stopped pretending they could afford a life beyond their means, there was far less to fight about. Marjorie quietly reclaimed her own home after the eviction process concluded. There were no triumphant social media posts this time, no carefully staged family photographs, and no captions proclaiming that family always comes first. She simply returned to living alone, and from what I heard through mutual friends, she seemed to appreciate the peace far more than she had before. Callum continued visiting me from time to time, but those visits were different now. He no longer walked through my house studying the rooms or unconsciously measuring the space the way he had during that first uncomfortable dinner. Instead, he asked about the roses blooming in the garden, the mystery novel lying on my coffee table, or whether I wanted help replacing a light fixture on the back porch. Our conversations became quieter and more genuine. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional speeches, and no single moment that erased everything that had happened between us. Relationships rarely heal that way. What grew instead was something steadier, built slowly through ordinary conversations, consistent actions, and mutual respect. One afternoon, while we were pruning the climbing roses together, Callum paused and looked around the yard before turning back toward me. "I used to think this house was the reward," he admitted. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I realize it was the result." I returned his smile. "There's an important difference." He nodded without another word because he finally understood what I had tried to teach him months earlier. My home had never been a prize waiting to be handed to the next generation. It was the product of decades spent making difficult choices, delaying gratification, paying debts before creating new ones, and building a life one careful step at a time. As the seasons changed, I found myself appreciating the house in ways I hadn't for years. The quiet mornings with coffee on the back porch afternoons spent reading beside the front window evenings, tending the flower beds, and weekends filled with friends from my book club reminded me that I had built more than a home. I had built a life that reflected patience instead of urgency and contentment instead of comparison. Looking back now, I know I could have chosen the easier path. I could have handed over my house, convinced myself I was helping, and postponed the consequences that eventually forced Callum and Bryn to change. For a little while, everyone might even have thanked me. But comfort borrowed from someone else's sacrifice never lasts. The lessons they eventually learned were difficult, yet they were also honest. They discovered that stability isn't created by acquiring a larger house or a more expensive car. It grows quietly from discipline, realistic expectations, and the willingness to live within your means, even when everyone around you seems to be chasing something bigger. One evening after Callum had gone home, I walked through each room before turning off the lights for the night. The hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my feet. Family photographs still lined the hallway, and the familiar silence wrapped itself around the house exactly as it always had. Standing there, I realized nothing about this home had ever been inherited, borrowed, negotiated, or gifted. Every wall, every window, and every memory represented years of work, restraint, and perseverance. Most importantly, it was still exactly where it belonged, with me. Life continued moving forward after that, not with dramatic breakthroughs or sudden reconciliations, but with the quiet consistency that comes from people finally accepting responsibility for their own choices. Months passed without another crisis, and for the first time in years, my phone no longer rang because someone needed rescuing. When Callum reached out, it was usually to ask how my garden was doing, whether I'd finished the novel I was reading, or if I wanted company for a cup of coffee on a Sunday afternoon. Those conversations were simple, but they were honest, and honesty proved far more valuable than the uneasy peace we had maintained when money stood between us. One afternoon, nearly a year after that first dinner, Callum stopped by carrying a small toolbox instead of another problem. The porch railing had become loose after a winter storm, and before I even mentioned it, he had already noticed. We spent the afternoon replacing a few boards, tightening old hardware, and talking about ordinary things. At one point, he leaned back, looked across the yard, and quietly admitted that debt counseling had changed the way he viewed almost everything. He told me he had learned to budget every paycheck before spending it, to save before upgrading anything, and to stop comparing his life with carefully edited photographs posted by other people online. None of those lessons had come easily, but they had lasted because he had earned them himself instead of having someone else erase the consequences. Bryn changed more slowly. According to Callum, accepting a simpler lifestyle had been difficult for her. Yet over time, she also began letting go of the constant pressure to appear successful. They no longer chased larger homes, newer cars, or expensive purchases that existed mainly to impress strangers. Their apartment remained modest, but it gradually became stable, and stability accomplished what appearances never could. Arguments became less frequent. Bills were paid on time, and the future finally stopped feeling like an emergency that needed someone else's money to survive. Marjorie and I also spoke from time to time, although our conversations were very different from the ones we shared before everything happened. There was no lingering debate about my house, no subtle suggestions, and no attempts to revisit decisions that had already been made. One afternoon, she admitted that living through the same situation herself had forced her to understand something she had completely overlooked before. She said it was easy to encourage generosity when someone else was expected to make the sacrifice, but far more difficult when the responsibility became her own. I appreciated her honesty, and we left the conversation there because nothing more needed to be said. As for me, I continued living exactly where I had always intended to live. I spent my mornings tending the flower beds, my afternoons volunteering at the local library, and my evenings enjoying the quiet comfort of a home that had been built one careful decision at a time. Every room reminded me of the years my husband and I spent working toward this life, and instead of feeling guilty for protecting it, I finally felt grateful that I had. Looking back now, I realize the conflict was never truly about a house. The house simply revealed the different ways each of us viewed responsibility. Some people saw it as a shortcut that could solve every problem overnight, while I saw it as the result of decades of patience, discipline, and sacrifices that no one else had lived through. Once that difference became clear, every decision afterward became surprisingly simple. Today, Callum no longer expects me to rescue him, and I no longer feel obligated to protect him from every mistake he makes. Instead, we share something much healthier than we had before: mutual respect. It took difficult conversations, painful consequences, and firm boundaries to get there. But the relationship we have now is stronger because it rests on truth instead of expectation. When I lock my front door each evening and walk through the quiet rooms of my home, I no longer see an asset waiting to be passed around according to someone else's plans. I see a lifetime of work, countless ordinary decisions made with care, and a future that remains exactly where it belongs. My husband and I built this home step by step, and after everything that happened, I know with complete certainty that protecting what we earned was never an act of selfishness. It was simply an act of respecting the life we spent decades creating together. Looking back now, I don't believe the most important part of my story was the evening Marjorie suggested that my house should belong to someone else, or the months that followed as Callum and Bryn struggled to recover from their own decisions. Those moments simply exposed something that had been true all along. A home isn't valuable because of its size, its location, or the comfort it provides. It's valuable because it represents years of disciplined sacrifice and quiet choices that no one else had to make. Asking someone to hand over the result of that journey isn't generosity. It's asking them to erase the path they spent a lifetime walking. For a long time, I worried that saying no would damage my relationship with my son. In the end, I discovered the opposite was true. Boundaries didn't destroy our relationship. They forced it to become honest for the first time in years. Once money was removed from the center of our conversations, respect finally had room to return, and that proved to be far more valuable than any temporary solution I could have offered. Perhaps the hardest lesson was realizing that helping someone and rescuing someone are not the same thing. Real help encourages people to grow stronger, even when the process is uncomfortable. Rescue, on the other hand, often delays the very lessons they need to learn. Had I given Callum my house, I might have postponed his problems for a little while, but I also would have postponed his chance to become financially responsible. Sometimes the kindest decision is the one that allows people to experience the consequences that ultimately change them. If my story leaves you with one thought, I hope it's this: never feel guilty for protecting what you've spent your life building. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, even if they don't understand them immediately. Those who become angry when you say no are often revealing that they valued your resources more than your well-being. Your kindness should always be offered freely, but it should never be treated as an obligation that others are entitled to claim. Today, when I walk through the quiet rooms of my home, I don't simply see walls, windows, or furniture. I see every year of hard work, every sacrifice my husband and I made together, and every lesson that brought us to this place. That house was never just a destination. It was the reward for a lifetime of building wisely, living within our means, and refusing to take shortcuts. Protecting it wasn't an act of selfishness. It was an act of honoring the life we had earned, and that is something no one should ever be ashamed of.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful: love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.